Hello, my name is Valerie, and today I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in January 2017. I actually managed to read 6 books in January, which is pretty unusual for me, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first book that I read in January was The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. I've been wanting to read this book forever. It's one of the first books I remember hearing about on BookTube, and I finally got around to reading it. So this is a post-apocalyptic novel from 1951, and I don't know why I weirdly thought that it would be lighter than it was when 1984 was written in the 40s, and it is decidedly not light, but I don't know, I just thought that this book would not get as real as it did. So in this book we follow Bill Mason, a man who at the beginning of the book is staying in the hospital after having had an eye surgery with his eyes bandaged. The night before, everyone all over the world is talking about these amazing shooting stars that are happening everywhere and how amazing it is, and of course he can't see them because his eyes are still bandaged from his surgery. So the next morning, upon waking up, Bill quickly discovers that everyone who saw the shooting stars the night before is now blind, which includes practically everyone on Earth. Luckily, Bill's eye surgery was successful, so he can still see, but he's one of a very few, and society starts to fall apart fast, and he has to find a way to survive. Unfortunately, not only is nearly everyone blind, but also the mysterious walking plants that appeared on Earth a few years previously, called Triffids, they may be taking advantage of humanity's situation. Like I said, I did not expect this book to get so real so fast, but parts of it are a little bit like The Walking Dead in terms of just showing a realistic collapse of society, in a situation like this, with everyone suddenly going blind. One thing I did like about this book, though it wasn't perfect, was that it generally didn't imply that blindness in and of itself makes a person incapable. What makes society fall apart in this book is the suddenness of nearly everyone going blind all at once, overnight, and the inability of society to quickly adapt to that. If no one can drive to work for days on end because they can't see, then jobs don't get done, and it doesn't take long for the whole thing to fall apart. This book also did a great job of showing how people reacted differently to the situation, some of them taking advantage of people, and some of them trying to make an effort to help other people, and some people were kind of in a gray area. So if you like dystopians or post-apocalyptic novels, then I think you may enjoy this book. The next book I read last month was You're Never Weird on the Internet, Almost, by Felicia Day. I think the first thing I saw Felicia Day in was probably Dr. Horrible, the web series from probably 2008 or 2009. And I thought she was great in it, although I had no idea who she was. And since then I've become a fan of her YouTube channel, Geek and Sundry. You may also know her from Supernatural, or her web series The Guild, or a host of other geeky things. Prior to reading this book, though, I really didn't know anything about Felicia Day's backstory, so I was very surprised to learn that she's from Alabama. She was homeschooled, and that in college, which she started when she was 16, she double majored in violin and math. She also talked a lot in the book about her early years discovering community online, which I definitely related to. And she also, at one point, she even mentioned Prodigy, which was an internet service that my family and I had when I was like 5 years old. It mostly consisted of message boards and games. Like, I've never heard anyone else even mention Prodigy. Felicia also writes quite a bit about her experiences with anxiety and depression, which was very inspiring because I think she seems like such a happy, quirky, upbeat person when I see her online and on TV that, it's easy, I think, for people to assume that anyone with such an upbeat personality like that couldn't possibly suffer from depression or any kind of mental illness. And I think that's a huge stereotype. That people that are depressed are just, constantly sad all the time, or look sad all the time, when that's not always the case. So I was glad that she shared her story and was open about her depression and anxiety and how she's found ways to get through that. Especially if you enjoy her work, you know, in TV or on Geek and Sundry or anything, then you'll probably find this book delightful, so I would recommend it. The next book I read last month was Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. I read this book on a whim after I finished the Felicia Day book. I couldn't decide what to read, and I was sitting in front of my bookshelf with all my books, and I finally just grabbed one off the shelf, which happened to be this one. And I'm so glad I did, because this book is amazing. It's totally understandable that this book won a Pulitzer Prize, because it sucked me in from the very first story. So this is a collection of short stories, mostly about either immigrants from India to the US or Indian Americans already living in the US, and just every single story just made you feel for the characters and was, you know, heartbreaking in some cases. This book is basically everything you could hope for in a collection of short stories. Aside from Agatha Christie short stories, I had never really read many short stories prior to this, and now I want to read all the short stories, because if this is any indication, granted this did win a Pulitzer Prize, so I'm sure it's like one of the top ones, but if this is any indication of the kind of thing that you read about in short story collections, then I want to read more of it. So if you have any short story collection recommendations, please let me know. I have a couple on my TBR, but I would love more. This book completely and totally captured me from the very first story, which was about a young Indian American couple learning to be vulnerable with each other again, thanks to a power outage. And I loved pretty much every story in the book. I pretty much devoured this book in less than 24 hours. It is pretty short, but still. And I think it's a book that I will probably want to reread at some point, because it was just so good, and I feel like if I read it again, I would probably notice things that I didn't even notice the first time through, because it was so rich and the characters were so real, and it was just amazing. So if you haven't read this, then you should go read it, because it's amazing and well deserving of the Pulitzer Prize that it won. And apparently, Jhumpa Lahiri, which I hope I'm not completely butchering her name, but apparently she has several other short story collections, and I believe 1 or 2 novels as well, so I'm very excited to hopefully read those at some point. The next book I read in January was Something Rotten by Jasper Fforde. This is the 4th book in the Thursday Next series. In case you haven't heard me go on and on about the Thursday Next series or all of Jasper Fforde's books, which I feel like I talk about a lot. The Thursday Next series is about a literary detective whose name is Thursday Next. She lives in what we would think of as an alternate universe, 1980s England. So in this alternate universe, there have been huge advances in genetic technology, and so dodos have been basically resurrected. You can just have a dodo made. Thursday has one as a pet. Also, literature, particularly Shakespeare, is hugely popular, like Harry Potter levels of popular. So much so that Thursday, being a literary detective, her job is to do things like weed out, fake Shakespeare manuscripts and things like that. And last but not least, in this alternate universe, which sometimes didn't feel so alternate, a giant corporation controls basically everything. There's puns and satire and time travel and literary references, and these books are always delightful. As for this installment in particular, I really enjoyed this one. I felt like the plot tied up together really well and was fun and wacky, but not so confusing that I wasn't sure what was going on, which was my slight problem with the 3rd book in this series. As usual with Jasper Fforde, there were many moments that had me laughing out loud, including mostly puns, and also including one joke that Jasper Fforde must have been waiting 3 books to make, which is a long setup for a pun. The political satire in this book was amazing. That is to say, painfully accurate. And the end of the book even made me tear up a little bit. So, if any of this sounds like fun to you, then I would highly recommend this whole series. The first book is called The Air Affair. The next book that I read this month is the only one I don't have a copy of. I read it as an ebook that I checked out from the library. But it was Sailing Alone Around the Room by Billy Collins. So this was a poetry collection, actually, and I have never been a poetry fan at all. Like, I've found very few poems that I can genuinely say I have enjoyed. But I wondered sometimes if it was just that I hadn't read the right poet or the right poem, and it seems like that might have been the case. So on a whim, I Googled poets for people who don't like poetry, and Billy Collins' name was the first one that came up. So I saw that my local library had a copy of his collected works as an ebook, and so I checked it out and started reading it, and I was stunned to find that I kind of loved it. His poems are some of the topics are kind of typical poetry topics you would expect, like the outdoors and that kind of thing. But they also talk about science and history and literature, and always in kind of an unexpected way, and I just really enjoyed that. I think these poems were just the right mix of fun, but also kind of thought-provoking. One poem was about how people would weigh more or less on different planets, and one poem was a beautiful description of what a history of weather would be like. And there was another poem that talked about how we always only ask the same question about angels, how many could dance on the head of a pin, but we never ask them anything else interesting about themselves and what other questions we could ask them. So even if you are typically not a poetry person, which I definitely am not, then I would maybe recommend giving this book a try if you're interested in reading some poetry, because, like I said, I'm usually not a poetry fan at all, and I quite enjoyed this. So the last book that I read in January was El coronel no tiene quien le escriba, or The Colonel Doesn't Have Anyone Who Writes to Him, by Gabriel García Márquez. And I've been trying to read this book forever. I do speak Spanish, and I've been wanting to read more books in Spanish to get some practice in. I actually just got a new job at work in the translation department, so I'm wanting to get back into my Spanish and get some more practice with it. And so I thought, okay, I'm gonna read this book because it's only 99 pages. I can get through it, and I think that every time that I start reading this book, I would say that I have read the first chapter of this book about 4 times, because I'll think, oh, it's only 99 pages, I'll finish it this time, and I'll read the first chapter and then I'll forget about it. So I finally finished it this time, which I'm very proud of. As for the book itself, I have to say this is a very sad book. Like, not in kind of a, something sad happens, it's really sudden, but more of just a quiet, steady sadness throughout the entire book. So this book is about an elderly couple living in South America, presumably Colombia, where the author is from. So the couple's son has recently died, and the only hope that they have to escape from their truly extreme poverty is the hope that the husband will finally get his veteran's pension that he's been waiting for 15 years. And also, they have a rooster that their son left them, which is expected to win a fight in town that might get them some money as well. But that's where the name of the book comes from, The Colonel. No one writes to the Colonel. It's because he always goes out to wait for the mail off the boat, because apparently I don't know if they live on an island or what's going on with it, but he goes to check the mail off the boat. There's never anything for him regarding his pension, and he's been waiting for 15 years. So the book is really just about them struggling to, get by on what little they have left, since they have no income, and the Colonel holding on to this wild hope that eventually, even though he's waited 15 years with no response, that eventually he'll be given his due and get his pension. This book made me frustrated and upset at, their situation and at the people around them who were mostly of zero help whatsoever. And, at the bureaucracy and politics that could cause a person's veteran's pension to get tied up for 15 years. So this was great Spanish practice and a very well-written book. Gabriel García Márquez is, one of the top Latin American novelists of our time. But if you're going to read this, fair warning, it's not a happy book. It's really not. But like I said, it is very well written, so if it sounds like something that you would like to read, then I would highly recommend that you give it a shot. So those are all the books that I read in January. I'm already at the problem that I'm reading like 4 books at once right now. I'm filming this on February 11th, and I don't think I finished a single book this month because I'm reading like 4 books at once. So we'll see how many books I manage to finish in February. So let me know in comments if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts on them are. Or if you've read any particularly good books in January that you would like to recommend. So until next time, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.